Hello, everyone. Welcome to Epics and Earrings, a place where we celebrate beautiful books, great stories, and character-inspired style statements. I'm your host, Jess. Here we read, we exchange ideas, and we extract wisdom to live epic lives, all while looking fabulous. Please share, like, follow, subscribe, or ring the notification bell. It costs nothing to do all the things to make this channel a smashing success. Today, we will take a seat in a nook of the Epic Reads bookstore for our very first official book club meeting as we discuss the first chapter of Volume 1, Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Well, Chapter 1, we are meeting Catherine Morland. She is the heroine of this story, so to speak. But the use of the word heroine is very tongue-in-cheek. Jane Austen is using it that way. And I didn't understand when I was first reading this chapter. I didn't get that because I think you do need to understand a little bit of context for that. And also you need to get a little further into the book before you realize what she's trying to achieve. We're not in Jane Austen's time, so it didn't just naturally occur to me. I could tell she was being a little sarcastic, but I didn't quite understand what she was trying to say. So let me read to you a little bit of the first chapter. No one who had ever seen Catherine Morland in her infancy would have supposed her born to be a heroine. Her situation in life, the character of her father and mother, her own person and disposition were all equally against her. Her father was a clergyman, without being neglected or poor, and a very respectable man, though his name was Richard, and he had never been handsome. He had a considerable independence besides 2 good livings, and he was not in the least addicted to locking up his daughters. Her mother was a woman of useful plain sense, with a good temper, and what is more remarkable, with a good constitution. She had 3 sons before Catherine was born, and instead of dying and bringing the latter into the world, as anybody might expect, she still lived on, lived to have 6 children more, to see them growing up around her, and to enjoy excellent health herself. Now, these things, these good-natured things about Catherine's parents and her birth are presented as almost negatives. They're presented as kind of boring. Like, her father is a clergyman, but he's not neglected or poor, so he doesn't have that going for him. His name's Richard, which is unfortunate, and he's never been handsome. So there's nothing really heroic about her father. Her mother has plain good sense. She's one of those women that she's having babies, she's doing life, she's very robust and healthy. And actually for the time, that would be a great thing. But as Jane is explaining it, it's in a way to say that it's pretty unremarkable. When having 10 children that all survive, in the 1800s would be extremely remarkable. But there's nothing remarkable in a good way. We then get an explanation of Catherine and all of the Morlands as being rather plain. Even though they're healthy, everybody has all their arms and limbs, people are living good lives here, they are not considered handsome or super attractive. Catherine had a thin, awkward figure, a sallow skin without color, dark, lank hair, and strong features. So much for her person, and not less unpropitious for heroism seemed her mind. She was also fond of all boys' plays and greatly preferred cricket, not merely to dolls. So she was the first girl and had older brothers, so it makes perfect sense that she was a bit of a tomboy, which is a word that we used in the 90s and don't use now. It disappeared. It just whoo. But I guess it's not as correct to use now. But we used to say that about girls that were into boys' sports and things. They were tomboys back then in the olden days. So Catherine is a little tomboyish. It describes her as often inattentive, occasionally stupid, because, she's a typical child. And she doesn't do anything very well. She's not remarkable in any way. She's not remarkable in French. She's not remarkable in writing and accounts, which I'm assuming might be mathematics, which was taught by her father. French taught by her mother, and it says that she shirked her lessons in both whenever she could. So she is, it says, what a strange, unaccountable character. Well, again, that is being sarcastic. She's not really a character very much at all, yet she is the character that Jane chooses for her novel. Now, Jane is writing this when she's 20-something. This is one of her first novels, but it isn't published until after her death in her 40s. And so I've read some people say that this is maybe the less fleshed out of her characters and dialogue of some of her books, because she is younger. And she's speaking about a girl who's a young girl. So such was Catherine Morland at 10, Jane Austen writes. At 15, appearances were mending. She began to curl her hair and long for balls. Her complexion improved, her features were softened by plumpness and color, her eyes gained more animation, and her figure more consequence, which we all know what that means. Her love of dirt gave way to an inclination for finery, and she grew clean as she grew smart. She had now the pleasure of sometimes hearing her father and mother remark on her personal improvement. Catherine grows quite a good-looking girl. She's almost pretty today, were words which caught her ears now and then, and how welcome were the sounds. To look almost pretty is an acquisition of higher delight to a girl who had been looking plain the first 15 years of her life than a beauty from her cradle can ever receive. So at 15, Catherine is starting to improve. Her looks are starting to improve. What I didn't realize until I read a little further on is that Jane would have, at the time that she's writing this novel, she would have read other novels that were considered Gothic novels. Now, these novels are what she's basing some of this description on. Not that she's completely unattractive, but she's just not what the Gothic novel that writer would have described as her heroine. And so Jane is setting Catherine up as something different and maybe poking a little fun at the idea of beauty and heroism in the Gothic novel of the time. Now, to explain a little bit about the nature of Gothic novels, I am turning to The Friendly Jane Austen, which I got from the library. This is by Natalie Tyler. The intellectual tenor of the late 18th century was characterized by a strong faith in the power of rational thought to comprehend and explain the natural world, and by skepticism about the supernatural, except in the case of Orthodox Anglican Christianity. But perhaps because of the emotional and imaginative sterility of merely rational thought, a strong countercurrent in the arts established a fashion for literature that would excite the emotions of fear and wonder. Among the first of such exercises in supernaturalism was Horace Walpole's Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto. I hope I'm saying that right. Otranto, 1764, which features a labyrinth of hidden tunnels, ghosts, bizarre portraits of doom, and Catholicism, for the 18th century British reader, is still a surviving body of medieval superstition. Walpole's Gothic novel was followed over the subsequent decades by hosts of others. And another really more famous one was Anne Radcliffe, which Catherine refers to and Jane refers to as the writer of Northanger Abbey. Very interesting. Now, Anne Radcliffe wrote 5 Gothic novels, including The Mysteries of Udolpho and the Italian or the Confessional of the Black Penitents. So there would be a castle, and there would be the moors, which were sort of these, which are these tempestuous places in Great Britain that are stormy and dark. And, think Wuthering Heights, think Jane Eyre. And if you compare how Catherine in Wuthering Heights Catherine is described by Emily Bronte, it's quite different from this Catherine. In Wuthering Heights, Catherine is described as a wild, wicked slip of a girl, a real beauty, the queen of the countryside, and is noted for her passionate nature, with quotes like, "Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same, and I wish I were a girl, again half savage and hardy and free." And this shows her tempestuous spirit and her desire for freedom and to buck the norms. This Catherine Morland, is not really bucking any norms. She's rather unremarkable. So you can see the difference between what the Gothic novels of the day would have described as their heroine, usually came from disadvantage, who usually came from, if you think of Jane Eyre, from, she might be an orphan, she might be without any kind of money or status. And so those are the types of characters that Jane would have read about herself. That is what we are contrasting. We're juxtaposing. You like that word, juxtaposing? We're contrasting. And that's what Jane is contrasting with her Catherine Morland. Mrs. Morland was a very good woman and wished to see her children everything they ought to be, but her time was so much occupied in lying in and teaching the little ones that her elder sisters were inevitably left to shift for themselves. And it was not very wonderful that Catherine, who had by nature nothing heroic about her, should prefer cricket, baseball, riding on horseback, and running about the country at the age of 14 to books, or at least books of information. She wanted to read novels. So from 15 to 17, she was in training for a heroine. She read all such works as heroines must read to supply their memories with those quotations which are so serviceable and so soothing in the vicissitudes of their eventful lives. So Catherine reads novels. And she read these Gothic novels. And if you remember the things that you used to read when you were 13, 14, 15, 16, what were they? What did they teach you about life? Because at that point you have very little life experience, obviously. So you are going to gain a lot of your ideas about life from what you're reading. I read a lot of Anne of Green Gables. I was not allowed to read things like The Babysitter's Club. I had rather strict parents in that regard, and I am glad now that they were strict, but it was definitely the way it was. But Anne of Green Gables probably was one of the series of books, because I read all of them. I read all of the series that Lucy wrote, Lucy Maud Montgomery. And so those would have been books that made me, like Gilbert was, to me, the perfect beau, the perfect man. I'm trying to think what other books I would have read at that particular time. I read some classics too that wouldn't have really informed necessarily my romantic side. I think it's obvious Mrs. Morland, who I really appreciate that Jane comments on Mrs. Morland being a good woman, but being a tired woman. She does not have the extra energy to make sure that all of her girls are turning out spectacularly. She's basically hoping that they do well, but she's not going to force them to do things. She kind of lets them do their own thing. And so this sounds to me like a lot of fun. There's no pressure for Catherine. And so she's going out and she's doing these fun things that boys usually get to do, and nobody's really overseeing it. And I love that even in that time period, I guess if you didn't have a governess or a nanny, you were still going to be quite tired. And if you're popping out 10 children, you are definitely going to be tired, and you're not going to have time to be super mom. So Catherine is left to her own devices, and she is reading these novels, and those novels are giving her ideas about romance. And I would assume at that time that romance, because I don't know a lot about the Romantic period, but while there's this push towards rational thought and all of those things, there's this countercurrent of the Gothic novels, and they were sweeping and romantic and illogical, which of course makes sense because we're always contradicting ourselves. If there's not, I think often what the subculture is whatever is lacking in the actual culture. And so it's kind of like, here's the Gothic novels and here's the rational, logical, this is how we're thinking through things. And then the Gothic novels are kind of underneath, feeding the need that people have to not be so rational. So they are maybe the equivalent of some of the things that our kids end up watching and reading right now that we're not real happy about. Okay, can we spend a little bit more time, reading something or doing something that contributes to your brain development and not just YouTube shorts or something, or playing video games, some kid playing video games. So it makes me feel a little better that this has always been an issue and a struggle for mothers and parents. There are a couple quotes in here that are, I think, male writers, predominantly male writers. Pope, Gray, Thompson. The only one, I recognize Pope and I recognize Shakespeare, but I don't know a lot about Pope. I don't know a lot about the other writers, and I did not do a ton of research on that. But what I will say is the quotes that Jane gives us are written by men, and they are interesting because, for example, Gray, the quote from Gray is, "Many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its fragrance on the desert air." Shakespeare quotes are, "The poor beetle which we tread upon in corporal sufferance feels a pang as great as when a giant dies." And then finally, like patience in a monument smiling at grief, is how Shakespeare is describing a young woman in love. So the flower born to blush unseen and waste its fragrance, and the poor beetle, which feels great pain, but we don't really notice it. Those two things, I feel like, harken back to maybe a sense of Catherine still feeling unseen or being worried that she isn't going to have a very heroic story. She's reading about these stories, but she's not actually living it out. And so there's this tragedy of a flower blushing but being unseen, a flower wasting its fragrance. There's this small tragedy of this beetle which we tread upon, and it feels great pain, but we don't really notice it. And so those themes of those seem to be about small unseen things that feel greatly, and that they are significant. We just don't recognize their significance. So I find that interesting. Those were the ones that sort of jumped out at me that might reflect how Catherine is feeling, or how we're supposed to look at her as being someone that may or may not feel seen, and who is maybe on the verge of being. The description of a young woman in love, like patience on a monument smiling at grief, I thought that was very interesting, because that's a Shakespeare quote about a woman waiting for attention. She's waiting for love. She's waiting to be in love, to have someone love her. And it is an idea, a very passive place for her to be. And it would have been, at the time, a very passive place for Catherine to be walking into as she's growing into a woman of marriageable age. Marriageable, I think, is the word I'm looking for. Of marriageable age. She's sort of waiting for someone to notice her. And so I guess Shakespeare's implying that looks very much like a monument smiling, a martyr, smiling at grief, as if a woman doesn't have something else to do with her life but wait for someone to fall in love with her. And that waiting time has to be this like sacrificial martyrdom kind of thing. And I guess it would have really been the idea at the time that the women were in this passive role of waiting patiently for that match. I can't put myself in the place of a woman of that time, because if you have a certain expectation of life, maybe you don't necessarily feel sad about it because it is what it is. But I, living in today's world, know that there are tons of opportunities for women, and should be. And so to me, this idea of waiting for a man to fall in love with me is silly, and very overdramatic. But it's in line with the Gothic novels. So she starts improving a little bit, but she still can't draw. And it says, "There she fell miserably short of the true heroic height," because she can't draw. I think Jane Eyre drew. I think there were other, famous heroines that drew. And they drew pictures of their love. But Catherine can't even do that. The other thing that we find out in this chapter is that there really isn't anyone in her neighborhood, in her surrounding neighborhood, who is someone who is noticing her, someone who she's inspiring passion in. There's no guy she's interested in and vice versa. That's really what she's saying. She's in this village. It's rather small. There's nobody, there's no great lords or baronets or counts to come and sweep her off her feet. And they even mention the boy accidentally found at the door, which sounds like a reference to Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights. And no ward and squire of the parish, no children. So there's nobody to kind of fall into and show up and be that hero for her. When you take a gender, women to be exact, and you say, okay, you can only operate within this little space. I just hit myself. Good job, Jessica. When you just operate in this little space, here's your postage stamp. Here's what you can do. I think what happens a lot, and it does happen in a lot of Jane's stories, is that the women find ways around that. But they still have to maybe appear as though they're doing what they're supposed to be doing in society, but then they find ways to subvert that, whether it's through manipulation, whether it's through being pretty conniving and aggressive. If you look at Pride and Prejudice, the mother is really just trying to make sure her girls have a good life, but she's considered this sort of crazy, neurotic woman, when in reality, that was creating her neuroses, was the limitations that society placed on her and on her girls. And so she had to find a way. She had to. And so I think that creates panic in some, that creates, manipulate. It causes other women to maybe be manipulative, because what other power do they have? If they try to have power to find a man and it goes outside of this, then they're considered crazy or neurotic or inappropriate. And so they have to find ways. So Mr. and Mrs. Allen Mrs. Allen realizes that Catherine may not find love where she is. So she might have to step out and find it somewhere else. And so because Mr. Allen has a gouty constitution, they have to go to Bath. And so it says, his lady, a good-humored woman, fond of Miss Morland, and probably aware that if adventures will not befall a young lady in her own village, she must seek them abroad, invited her to go with them. So we have Jane establishing that now Catherine is going somewhere else, and this may, in fact, change her life, her circumstances. And those are the types of things that people did back then in order to change their circumstances. For example, somebody having a ward that they would take in and sort of give status and their name and recognition to. There were people that would essentially be adopted by other family members in order to have the kind of life that their parents wanted and that they needed to have in this society, the best possible life, which meant status, which meant an income. And those things would not naturally be happening for Catherine, especially as a woman, but even for her brothers. The difference is her brothers, for example, her one brother is going to Oxford, and so he's at least getting an education. So Catherine's really she's at the mercy of going to a new place and finding out if there's anyone there for her as well. That was a lot for chapter 1. I really didn't plan on going into all of that, but there's so much that I've just been thinking about in this book, and there's so many layers. And I think that's what's great about Jane's work, is that there are so many layers. We know that Catherine is naive. We know that she is limited in her options where she's living. And we know that the Allens are going to take to Bath, and hopefully she'll have a very exciting and different experience there. So that is where chapter 1 leaves us. We have a not so heroic, almost pretty heroine who loves to read Gothic novels and who's about to experience some real life. And what will that bring for her? And what's so great about Bath? Bath, England is a place I didn't know a whole lot about until I started reading about it. But I guess Jane And her sister and her mother moved there after her father's death, which I believe was in the 1800s. Might have been right before the turn of the century, but they moved to Bath. So Jane was very familiar with Bath, and she did like Bath. She did, but I don't know that. I mean, it wasn't her favorite place ever, but she did like it. So she was very familiar with it, and so I am interested to know a little bit more about Bath. I will probably make a shorter video about that. So if you will oblige me, I will do maybe some shorter little snapshots that will provide some context and some information, but it's not as big of a commitment as listening or watching 30 minutes. Also, there are some videos that I will probably produce a little bit more with imagery and pictures and things like that. And there are some like this, which I will just be talking to you. And so you could do the dishes and the laundry and all the other stuff that needs to be done, or I don't know, whatever you're doing, clean your car. That's what I do when I listen to a lot of YouTube is sometimes I'll just have it in the background. I think there's just a lot of opportunity for different experiences on a YouTube channel and different ways to deliver information. So I'm looking forward to figuring out what everybody connects with and what works best and go from there. I really hope I touched on everything. I have so many things to say and I have so many thoughts in my head, and sometimes that's the problem, right? That is the problem. But I hope that you enjoyed that recap. It was very intense for the first chapter. I don't know that every chapter will be like that. Some are less eventful than others. So I just hope that you have fun and you come along for the ride and we enjoy this together. I would love to hear what you thought of this first chapter. And there really are no right or wrong answers. I just really want to open the forum for anyone to respond about the book. Maybe you are a Jane Austen fan. Maybe this is the first Jane Austen book you've ever read. So tell me what you thought. I would love to hear from you. All right. I will see you soon.